This week on Obsessed with Wine.
So I kind of seen the pharmaceutical track of organic chemistry. I just decided that's not exactly what I wanted. The pharmaceutical industry is kind of pretty ruthless in the fact that, you could be doing a really good job and never actually be on a successful drug campaign your entire career. The wine's something you could at least have a successful product at the end of, every year. Every year you make something, you put it in a bottle, and it's drinkable. So there is kind of that successful tale, something you can always show for it at the end of, the workday.
Hello, wine enthusiasts. My name is Wesley Cable. Welcome to another episode of Obsessed with Wine. For this episode, I really wanted to focus on the science of winemaking, specifically what happens in a wine laboratory. In my experience working in wineries over the years, the unsung heroes of every winemaking team are without a doubt the men and women who work in the laboratory. The lab typically contains a team of enologists who use chemistry to analyze the grapes and the wine during all phases of the winemaking process. Before harvest, the lab team runs analysis on grape samples to help the winemaker decide when the best time is to harvest that year's fruit. The team in the lab pay attention to things like Brix, which is the sugar level in the grapes, pH, acidity, and of course the grape's developing flavor profile. Once the decision is made to harvest the fruit, the grapes are brought to the winery and processed to prepare for fermentation. Once fermentation begins, the lab staff takes samples of the juice from every tank every day and monitors the progress of the fermentation. This helps identify any problems so the winemaker can decide if any intervention is necessary. Once the juice is done fermenting, the lab staff will continue to analyze the samples of the wine all the way through the bottling process to make sure that special spoilage organisms are kept at bay and don't ruin the finished wine. Even after the wine has been bottled, the lab team does quality control analysis of random bottles in all lots to make sure that the wine is still stable before it's sold to the consumer. Of course, this is an oversimplification of what is done in the lab, but I hope it gives you an idea of how vital the lab staff is in making world-class wines. If a winery has enough resources, it will have its own lab located at the winery. If this isn't possible, wineries are forced to use outside laboratories and pay for their analysis to be done for them. If the winery can afford it, they can purchase complex pieces of equipment for their lab staff that are used to simplify some of the wine analysis. This is much more efficient than doing it by hand, which allows the winery to process a lot more samples in a given day. This week, I sit down with Benjamin Eyer, a technical support and product specialist at Admeo Inc. in Beaverton, Oregon. Admeo Inc. is a company who sells and services special equipment and test kits that are used in wine analysis in the wine laboratory. Benjamin has a master's degree in organic chemistry and decided after graduation that he would pursue a career in wine instead of working for a company in biotech. In this interview, Benjamin and I talk about how he came to the decision to forego medical school to pursue a career in winemaking. He also talks about what it was like working for the famous Frank Family Vineyards in Napa, and why he decided to leave winemaking and start a career supporting wineries and winemakers in Oregon to help them make better wines. Pour yourself a glass of your favorite wine. It's time for Obsessed with Wine. Tonight's guest is Benjamin Eyer. He's currently working for Admeo Incorporated in Beaverton, Oregon, and he is a tech support and product specialist. So I'm really excited to talk to him about kind of the science of wine. Benjamin, how are you doing tonight?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Let me start with you. Your education is in chemistry. So just talking to people that I know who work in wine, and organic chemistry seems to be one of those things that everybody hates. But I guess you got a master's degree in organic chemistry. So how did that all come about?
So I was an undergrad. I had an influential advisor, Dr. Murphy, who was kind of someone I took a first chemistry class with, the second intro chem class. And through conversations with him, I decided to major in chemistry. And then second year chemistry majors take organic chemistry one and two, and I enjoyed it. I learned very well spatially and looking at like pictures of things. So organic chemistry is obviously very picture driven or shape driven when you talk about like the molecules drawn out on a piece of paper or even thinking about them three-dimensionally. So I was good at it. It was mentally intriguing to me and I enjoyed it. So that's kind of how I ended up down the chemistry path at Allegheny, but then also eventually going to graduate school, although that was kind of a later decision. I didn't really decide what I was doing till my senior year when I had to like apply to medical school, pharmacy school, graduate school, or just, consider getting a job. So that's kind of how that came about.
So Pittsburgh, University of Pittsburgh. So did you grow up in Pittsburgh?
No, I grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, so southeastern Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh is, there's a big connection between Allegheny College and Pittsburgh from a student body standpoint. Probably about a third of the students are coming from, Pittsburgh, maybe another third roughly from Buffalo, and then the other group is from Cleveland, and there's some more intermixed in. The school's a little more diverse now than when I was there, but when I was there, I would say almost probably 80% of the student body came from one of those three metropolitan areas that are all sitting about 2 hours away or so.
So when you were in Pittsburgh, or where you grew up and all that, is there any wine country, or is there wine being made in that area?
Yes and no. A lot of people are shipping grapes in from California, bulk grapes or bulk juice, and fermenting it. There are some French hybrids planted, much like you see up in New York and some areas of Virginia, but not really what we would think of as like wine country on the West Coast from the expansiveness of the vineyards or the number of wineries that are there. Yeah, it's a little different. Yeah.
So how did you end up getting into wine, I guess? I mean, when you were taking these chemistry classes and you were getting your degree, was that even on your mind, or how did this love of wine even happen?
Not in undergrad, I would say. That wasn't really a thought at that time. My grandpa had some French hybrids in his backyard, probably about 4 rows. So that would be probably my first introduction to wine around like family dinners and like I would say holidays. But in graduate school is when I got in and I had done kind of an internship at Amgen in Thousand Oaks, California, which is a pretty big, decent sized biotech. So I kind of seen the pharmaceutical track of organic chemistry. I'd seen what my advisor obviously was doing in graduate school, which was writing a lot of grants. And I just decided that's not exactly what I wanted. The pharmaceutical industry is kind of pretty ruthless in the fact that, like, you could be doing a really good job and never actually be on a successful drug campaign your entire career. So the wine's something you could at least have a successful product at the end of, well, every year. Every year you make something, you put it in a bottle, and it's drinkable,
Right.
even if it's not the best it could be. So there is kind of that successful tale, something you can always show for it at the end of, like, I guess, the workday, quote unquote. So that was one thing. And then I was looking for something more diversity. Wine's got agriculture, chemistry, business. There's obviously a human component. There's a sensory component. So it's a little bit more diverse than maybe the chemistry I was doing in graduate school, but also includes other things, I would say.
So it's interesting. So you get your degree, you get this chemistry degree, and then was it, all right, now I'm going to pursue finding a career in wine, or was it, I need further education? It looks like you got a winemaking certificate from UC Davis. So was that just part of getting more practical wine making knowledge, that kind of a thing?
Yeah, so I think graduate school's the biggest thing it taught me was how to self-teach, self-learn, how to pull and collate resources and then go through them and understand them from a comprehension standpoint. It's just what we did on a daily basis. You'd have to read papers and then apply them to what you were doing in the lab. So while I was in graduate school towards the end, when I kind of was thinking about this, I started the first UC Davis because it was kind of like, is this really what I want to do? Because I was going to leave a PhD program. So I was going to leave with my master's. It was going to be a decision that would end that somewhat, at least temporarily, if I didn't decide to come back pretty soon. So once I kind of made that decision, then I was still working on the rest of their certificate classes through, I think, my first two harvests, the one in Chile and the one in California. And that's when I finished the certificate. But the certificate was just kind of one to gauge interest, but also gain more practical experience. So I could breeze through a lot of the chemistry stuff that maybe some other people struggled with because it was basic from what I had done. While wine is a very complicated medium, wine chemistry and what we generally analyze if you're not at a research institution is pretty basic chemistry analysis. was the easier portions of most of the classes, but then some of the deeper stuff, but actual winemaking was more the practical stuff. But then I picked up some in the courses as well. So it's kind of the courses were how to ask the right questions, is I would say what I learned mostly in them.
So I got the making certificate as well from UC Davis, and I'm one of those students that you were just talking about who was terrified of the actual chemistry that they were talking about. But I enjoyed the program, the winemaking certificate. For me, it was also kind of the same. It was, is this something I really want to know and I want to learn about and all that stuff? And I think it just solidified all those things for me too. So you mentioned it a minute ago. So you went to Chile and actually worked there, and I know that's a growing wine region in Chile. So what was that experience like?
So I don't remember how long it was, but wasn't much more than a week. I was running around finishing up like the official documentation stuff you have to do when you get any degree, especially a graduate degree. And then I pretty much hopped on a plane and went to Chile and was there from late February, early March, the whole way through mid-June. At one point, I had to leave the country and go renew my visa by going to Argentina. It was an interesting experience in that aspect as an American abroad. It was myself, and then there were two other, I guess, Chilean winemaking students that were living in a house with a third. She was like temporary seasonal help, but we all shared a house together. So it was me, myself, and three Chileans living in a house. And then we had a bus that came and picked us up every day along with all the other cellar workers and took us over to the winery, which is probably about 10-minute drive. So I was living in Requinua, which is probably about an hour and something outside of Santiago. And the town where the actual physical winery was like 5 houses, and it was called Totiwe. And pretty much all the vineyards around the winery were owned by Conchi Toro, and you could tell that because all the vineyard workers had decaled matching clothing when they were out in the vineyard. That winery, Viña Santa Carolina, I think has an import company through Houston. So they do have wines in the United States. They do a lot of export to Brazil. At least when I was there, they were doing a lot of export to Brazil, and they had a lot of Brazilian tourists come through the winery at harvest. My bosses, the winemakers, would be giving tours to during the vintage. And yeah, we were kind of in charge of like managing the cellar. So it was kind of a trial by fire because I was somewhat underqualified for what I was being asked to do at the time. And it was just a lot of figuring it out on your feet and essentially just getting grapes into tanks as fast as possible. The facility didn't do this much, but the brand, I think, does about 6 million cases bottling, and some of that is bulk wine purchase, but they're big, and they had 5 wineries throughout Chile. We saw a lot of grapes.
You have any of those Chilean wines sitting around that you helped make?
None that I helped make, but I do have some that I bought while I was there. So they would be older, like 4 or 5 years older. So I still have a few of the ones that I brought back. It's a funny story about leaving the airport in Santiago. So I got dropped off the airport, was flying home. I was like, you do that game where you pick up your suitcase and you decide it's like 50 pounds or not. Obviously it was in kilos, but they put it on the scale and I looked at it, I go, that is way over like 60 pounds. But they just like waved it through, didn't say anything, didn't like charge me. And I was just like, all right, well, I was like waiting for a huge bill, but.
So was that your first experience working a harvest was in Chile, or did you have something prior to that here in the States?
No, that was my first experience.
So then after you went to Chile and you came back, you also worked for Frank Family Vineyards in California. So I know that's a big name and they're very popular. Everybody loves Frank Family wines. And so what was that experience like? How can you contrast that with working in Chile?
It was kind of somewhat night and day in different ways. One, Chile was like mostly in Spanish, although there was a lot of Spanish speaking cellar crew, permanent staff at Frank Family. So there was, I think, 2 individuals that didn't really speak great English, so we all often converse in Spanish. So that would be the one major difference. But case size, I mean, Frank Family, I think at the time when I was there was only like 160,000 cases. I mean, drastically different from the amount of fruit that we were seeing at harvest. Things came in bins more often than not, or actually always at Frank Family, whereas we saw a lot of gondolas in Chile at Santa Carolina. So that would be just scale is entirely different. Everything was hand sorted twice, so both cluster and berry at Frank Family, with the exception of like the whole cluster pressing of the Chardonnay. So that was different. But the scale, I'd say, is the biggest difference. And then the main reason I picked Frank Family is they did have everything from Pinot and Chardonnay, and they were known and did a lot of barrel fermented Chardonnay. So that was one interest. They had a pretty big sparkling program. Everything's hand riddled. You can see the etched lines, the painted lines on the bottom of their sparkling punts from them turning them in the riddling racks. They also did Zinfandel and Bordeaux varietal. So it was kind of trying to get a gambit in the second harvest, whereas we did a lot of Cabernet at Santa Carolina, and there was not a lot of whites.
So then, at Frank Family, you work with a lot of people, and a lot of people, I don't know, maybe they don't know this, but in a lot of wineries, there is a lot of Spanish-speaking employees, and so it's valuable for somebody like you who speaks Spanish, right? You're fluent Spanish speaker, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's so valuable in a winery to be able to speak English and Spanish, and just the ones I've worked in, the people that who can do that are so valuable to the team, and just being able to communicate with everybody and all that stuff. So I'm sure that actually served you pretty well.
I think it counts. It counts more in California than it does in Oregon, and I can't really speak for Washington, but California has, because of the size of the wineries, has a lot more like permanent cellar crews that like that is their job.
Hmm.
They're there for, most of their career. They might move, but they're not looking to be winemakers because Oregon wineries are much smaller. A lot of the cellar crew, there might be one or two of them or one, or you might just have an assistant winemaker that does everything. Then there's a lot less demand for like Spanish speaking as maybe as helpful of a skill. You see less of that here, because then it's usually communication with the vineyard crew in Oregon, whereas in California, it's like you said, across the gamut. The cellar crew could be the interns as well as the actual like the vineyard workers. It's a little bit of a scale thing between the two states still. I mean, Oregon definitely has a lot of wines at high price points and does well as a state, but we are small. We are very small from the standpoint compared to like California and a lot of the facilities even in eastern Washington.
Hmm. You ended up in Oregon, I guess, after that, right? After your Frank family experience, you ended up in Oregon. So why Oregon? I mean, there's so many other places all over the world that you probably could have gone and made wine. So what drew you to Oregon?
Logistics, I would say, at least originally. So my wife was finishing up her PhD at Carnegie Mellon in material science and engineering. So we had to find a spot where those careers and jobs would cross over with wine. So that's a finite list of places. And she somewhat got recruited to work at Intel, where she still works now. So essentially, Intel brought us to Oregon, and that's how I ended up at Trisaetum. Because I had to rush to find a job, which was easier to find a harvest job on a whim than a full-time gig. So that's how I ended up at Trisaetum.
So did you when you started working in the winery, you've got the science background and obviously you're an intelligent guy, you got this degree. Was it what you thought it was going to be working in the winery? Actually physically using your hands and making wine and all that stuff originally, was it exactly what you thought it was going to be?
I think so. I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't say I knew everything or every expectation. It was maybe a little different than I thought, but it wasn't like surprising or I guess traumatic. I think what was really difficult, at least initially, I would say not not the job in Chile, but like interviewing at Trisatum and even like at Rexel A to Z, convincing people that someone that had a master's degree and a PhD, I could see how that'd be even worse, would ever want to do any of this from like a hands-on standpoint. That was, I think, the most difficult part. And then once I was through those two, then it was less of a selling thing. But initially, and I know I kind of had Grady Wan. I don't know if he was still around the UC Davis program. Yeah, so Grady, obviously, we talked about that because he had some stories about having a PhD and trying to convince people that he wanted to like play around with grapes in a tank, and get his hands dirty. So like having a PhD would definitely have been more detrimental to that selling point. But I think that was the part that was hardest for me to understand is people not believing that.
Right. Not taking you seriously just because you have this science degree and it's like, well, why does this guy want to be here doing this kind of stuff, right? I mean, something like that.
Yeah, and I mean that's how the industry's always worked is you have to work your way up, and it's hard to tell a seller crew what you want them to do, understand what they might be doing if you haven't done some of it yourself.
So once you got to Oregon, so you mentioned A to Z. So that is that the first place you started, A to Z in Newburgh, Oregon?
I'd say it was my first full-time job or first real job, maybe ever, I guess, if you don't count any of the ones you had, working, in high school or college. I was at Trisatum for a vintage that was like August through mid-October. So that was my first experience harvest in Oregon, but that was only a harvest internship. And then going on to A to Z, I spent two harvests in almost, I guess what, like 2 and 3/4 years there. So that was, I think, kind of some of the defining moments in my career, at least from a learning standpoint. Partially because of the size of the winery. They were big enough from an Oregon standpoint that we did bottle all year. A bigger bottling line could have obviously fixed some of that, but they use Signature just like most other places do in Oregon, except their Signature truck lives at the winery as opposed to like it coming and going at different places. So we were bottling all year, we were filtering all year. So it was just constant learning because we were always running one of two different cross flows that we had, or even pad filtration. So we were constantly prepping for bottling, which means we were constantly doing things. Whereas like a lot of wineries in Oregon, they might bottle once or twice a year, or maybe just once a year. So you only have like one round of filtering, just like you have one harvest. So from a learning standpoint, you're somewhat limited from like a cellar viewpoint. We always had wine on the move. We always were blending. It was always a dance to keep up with the bottling truck. So I think a lot of my learning, understanding, and skills I definitely learned while being A to Z from like a practical seller standpoint.
Was your goal once you got to Oregon, like, okay, I'm going to get a job as a winemaker? That's really what I want to do, and I'm going to do whatever I got to do that. Like, was that your goal, is to be a winemaker somewhere, or did that just happen because of your experience, or how did that all come about?
I mean, when I started on this thing, the end game was always to be a winemaker, to make wine, to have like control, or at least a contribution of control to like the final product. So that was always the initial goal when I went down this road, either through the Davis certificate or even the first vintage. And then all of the other stuff was how to get there. So the education was obviously the theoretical, and then the practical, and almost like I would say stylistic learning, like what do I want to make and how do I want to make it, and how do you do that from a standpoint, because that's not something you can pull from a textbook. Like learning about different extraction things, you can understand what the different ways you can extract wine are, but then like understanding when you actually apply it to a tank of grapes, what physically happens, or how there's different vineyard contributions, and learning how to react to that on a fly at harvest. Because red ferments especially, move quickly. You have kind of 10 days of active heat and fermentation time where most of the work is done for the year. Whites are a little bit slower, a little easier to react to if something starts to move in a direction you don't like. But any red fermenting on skins is somewhat a runaway freight train that you're just trying to control with a little bit of cooling.
So then when was your first winemaker job? Where were you when you got the first job and got that title of, all right, I'm a winemaker? Where was that?
So I think at Montinore, I was an assistant winemaker, but then I was also listed as a winemaker for another brand that was owned by Ackley Beverage Group, which is the overarching ownership. They started another brand built around a vineyard that they purchased right before I got there, which was the former Merriman Vineyard. Couldn't keep the names. They had to rebrand it. We didn't know in Harvest 2017, and I started August 2017. So I started bottling and helping them get their cross flow going. Was the first thing I ever did at Montinore. I was the only person with prior experience with cross flow. Again, going back to A to Z, lots of time cross flowing. That vintage, we got fruit from that vineyard in Yamhill, Carlton, which is about 30 acres next to Carlton Hill, up the hillside from some Grand Moraine, as well as the Resonance Vineyard in Yamhill, Carlton. So you can spot now what is the new tasting room for Resonance from the top of the hillside. So we got that Pinot and a little bit of Chardonnay, and that was our first interaction with that vineyard. It took probably almost 2 years for a full brand to be established, but we were obviously making and nurturing the wine along the way and eventually bottled it. So I'd say going through the blending of those wines, that was my first experience as somewhat of a winemaker, at least by title. The first year at any company, especially when you start right before harvest and winemaking, there's a lot of catch up and learning and integration, and harvest is usually just about getting stuff done. So I'd say a lot of the winemaking, at least from a Pinot standpoint, is at times done at the blending stage as well, besides the actual active fermentation like we talked about before.
So we're definitely going to talk about Montinore, because I want to ask you about some of the wines and all that other stuff. But I want to transition right now to talk about what you do now. So at some point was it like, I'm a change in career, or I'm going to go try something else, and working for Admeo Incorporated? So how did that all come about?
So that came about, I guess I got to a point where I felt like I had learned everything that I could learn at Montinore. I'd been there for, pretty much half of my career, at least from a harvest standpoint, and 4 and something years. because I started in August 2017. So I kind of felt like I'd hit my like learning terminus. Not that, talking like big changes. There's always something you can pick up and learn from a new vintage and interaction, but I felt like that had somewhat stagnated. And then also I felt from like a contribution standpoint, I had somewhat contributed everything I could. I wasn't really adding any more value necessarily. I was still doing a job, but like talking about bigger picture, bigger change things. And there wasn't going to be, at least in the near future, an opportunity to move up. My boss and still the winemaker there, Steven, is not that old. So he wasn't like heading for imminent retirement or anything. That was kind of at least part of it. And then I knew that Admeo had the sales rep leaving, so I had reached out to Margit, the CEO and founder of Admeo, and this role was somewhat built around and developed for me. So that was kind of exciting and interesting. A new role. I mean, we're a very small company. We have less than 10 employees. And then we have a partnership with Biosystems in Barcelona, Spain, and they're the actual manufacturer side. So we distribute all the Biosystems instruments in the US. I had heard about them, going back to, again, A to Z, because A to Z was one of the first wineries to have a Y15 enzymatic called analyzer in Oregon from Admeo or Biosystems. I'd seen it there. I brought the instrument then to Montinore, and we got that in, I think, January 2019, so right after the 2018 harvest. So we were running mostly malics and acetics and maybe some glue-frus at that point. That's kind of how I ended up there. And then the secondary part is, I guess I thought it would be, and I had talked to people that had tried to do this, to start your own brand and do something on the side while you're trying to actively manage a harvest at a full-time job is a little bit different than if you work for a company where you're not busting your butt day to day for like a full vintage type timetable. So we're obviously busier at harvest from a support and service standpoint because everyone's hammering their analyzers, but it's not the same as like working a vintage. We're just busier because we'll be getting calls about, some intern had a malfunction or didn't understand something, broke something, or just the constant running of the instruments can cause some wear and tear.
So the company you work for, you guys provide for the wine industry. You provide enzymatic kits basically for people that want to, I guess, do testing at their own winery in the lab on their fermenting juice and wine, etc. So you guys provide these kits for these tests that wineries use to, to check on their fermentations and on their wines, etc. I mean, does that sound about right?
Yeah. So we have the kits and then we have the instruments. The instruments, obviously, the big upfront cost. The kits, I would say, generally, as long as you're being economical and taking care of, maintaining them at the temperature they're supposed to be maintained at in the fridge when you're not using them and before you even open them, they should last all to their expiration dates, which kind of comes out to about 80 cents per test, which is significantly cheaper than, the 30 something a pop if you send it out to ETS. And at least to me mentally, someone still has to go pull the sample either way. And there is some amount of labor to like input all the sample names and start up the instrument, but then the instrument's doing the rest of the work because it is an auto analyzer. So it's deciding when it wants to start different analysis so that it can make all of the measurement standpoints. And that does the math for you too. So you don't have to do that by hand, like with, the old cuvettes where you had to make sure you were adding in the appropriate reagent at the appropriate time, mixing them, letting them sit, not missing your endpoints, and then you still have to do the math. So this does all of it for you. Plus, we provide the kits, so you don't have to worry about making up your own buffers for the actual enzymatic test. So that's the service we provide, and then we spend a lot of time via tech support, which we can do quite a bit remotely by logging into people's computers and kind of seeing. We can't physically see the analyzer, so every once in a while it's involves a FaceTime of a phone aimed at an actual running instrument. If there's something weird sound-wise, we receive videos. We try to do as much as we can remotely, just so we can have quicker response time to any issues.
So I actually loved it. I worked in a lab a couple of times, and I got to do some of these tests, and I've seen both the the wineries who don't have the top of the line equipment and they're doing things, differently than the ones who actually have these machines that you're talking about that do this. And so I've seen kind of how that works. So this has always been something that's been fascinating to me, just the testing and all the lab work and all that other stuff. So for people who haven't had that experience and maybe, as far as how much science goes into all these tests and all that stuff, can you just explain what these machines do?
So each of the kits, if from the enzymatic standpoints, we'll just go that direction, since that's most of the analysis we care about: your acetic acid, volatile acidity, your malic, your glue-free, all of the traditional analysis that you want to monitor either from a start point to progression to end point of fermentation. Then obviously you're hoping your acetic is not increasing at a greatly rapid rate. The kits all have the buffer, and then they'll have the actual enzyme that's doing some sort of reaction. So you're measuring either a decreasing or increasing absorbance, depending on which kit you're talking about. So we're looking at a change in light source. So the analyzers are shooting light path through a reaction cuvette that starts by just having the sample amount of wine at a certain volume as well as the buffer. So it has a start point, and then you add in the enzyme, you measure again, and you measure an endpoint. So it's all looking at kind of differentials over time of absorbance, and then just essentially based on chemistry, math, that absorbance can be correlated to a concentration, but either you're increasing or decreasing, and that increase or decrease is associated with a specific volume of whatever you're trying to measure, whether that be sugar or malic acid or acetic. We also have some colorimetric tests that, again, similar. You're measuring change in color. It's a little bit more difficult and sensitive, especially to like a blank daily, just because you're looking at smaller changes between like where you start and end is going to cause a little bit more issues with precision. So there's ways around that. But the enzymatic kits are measuring like a finite and usually a bigger change. So there's several companies out there. I like Admeo the best. It's partially why I wanted to work with them. I think we have some of the best support and service in any industry from a timing standpoint, as well as resolving issues. I did joke with our one of our technical service guys. There's a box on our preventative maintenance form that was like, was the preventative maintenance successful or a failure? It's like, well, would you ever check the other box? If you didn't check the other box, you wouldn't be leaving, right?
Right,
So
exactly.
that was part of my draw to this company, was just the quality of like service and support that they offered, and also just I think the quality of the instruments. So I've always been impressed with them, and I posted it on LinkedIn, which you may or may not have seen, but we have a new analyzer out that's called the Spica. So it's in stage 3 of 4 for a software development standpoint, but it's been in some wineries, mostly in California, for about 8 months now. So they've kind of helped us with a lot of the initial onboarding and testing. So that's our newest analyzer, and it has even more advantages than the Y15. So we're pretty excited about that and introducing that to the US market.
For people who don't know, what do these machines cost? They must be, I mean, it's not something that every winery can afford, right? I mean, it's a pretty big expense for people to buy these machines. Is that not right?
So we have some leasing options that we offer people to help kind of spread the blow out. And we also have, it just depends. It depends how many tests you're running and how many lots you have. If you're making like, 5 barrels of wine or a very small volume, not going to make sense for you. I think people will be surprised if they run like through the ROI sheet we have, like how much they spend at outside labs versus like, per test. And then think about how many additional tests you might run for like, especially like towards the end of ferment for like glucose fructose to see if there's any sort of slowing of the ferment and if it might get stuck and stop prematurely and have residual sugar. So you might be running more tests than you would normally if you had to send it out at like, $20, $30 a sample for the different, lots that you have. So there's that. But again, back to like that comment, someone still has to go pull the sample at the end of the day. So at the end, the nice thing is if you send it to an outside lab, you probably won't see results before the end of the day. Whereas with like this analyzer, you can prioritize and pick what you want to see now and then react to those judgments during harvest. Because things during harvest, I would say the amount of work orders and the amount of different movements and things that were changing in the winery on any given day at harvest, that could be almost a month worth of action that occurs outside of harvest at a lot of wineries. There's just that many more moving things in a 24-hour day that are happening in that finite point where the wine's fermenting. And then you're kind of you're slowly heading towards bottling and aging and maturing and monitoring any type of spoilage. So it's a lot slower, a lot less action. Most of the work physically from like a work order standpoint, analysis standpoint, is done during harvest when things are rapidly changing.
So if I was a winery and I wanted to buy a machine for my lab that would do these tests for me and make things easier on the lab team and all that stuff, what does it cost me to buy?
So I think the Y15 is priced, I want to say about $27,000 right now, and it can do 60 to 70 tests per hour. Some of it is dependent on the particular test because the different kits, enzymatic kits, and depending what you're measuring, have slightly different incubation times between the tests in the warming well. But then again, back to how many tests are you looking to run? How many samplers are you going to send out? So a very small winery, probably not, but I think it would be surprising to a lot of people how quickly it becomes economical and how fast you might pay it off. Because if you pay it off in like 2 years, I mean, and you got your results arguably faster than if you had to wait for an outside lab to get back to you later that evening or the next day, is that worth it to you during harvest?
So another question I have is it like a computer where, okay, I buy this computer today and it costs me $27,000 and then let's say I pay it off in 2 years. Is there something that much better in 2 years that is way better than what I already have, kind of like how computers work?
We have some very old Y15s out there. I don't know off the top of my head when the first Y15 was in the older ones that are running, but there's some of the original, the Y25s, which preceded the Y15. Don't ask about the number. It doesn't fully make sense, but there's some original Y25s that are still around, and those people are just upgrading to the Spica, which is the new instrument. So they're all kind of similar sizes, and the Spica will probably someday replace the Y15, but we're still installing, and there are people that are still buying Y15s for various reasons. We have some bigger wineries that are only buying Y15s to run free sulfurs on because they're running that many tests. And then they might have a Y200 or 400 also that they're running all of their other tests on, the other enzymatic kits, the glufres, the malics, the acetics, but they're buying a Y15 just to run free sulfur on to monitor all of their lots. So the 200 and 400, that's where the number actually means something, and that's 200 and 400 tests or samples per hour. A lot of moving parts, a lot of samples being uploaded in a lot of different lots at those size facilities.
So, what I thought would be interesting is I don't know that just the casual wine drinker or anything understands what some of these things are that you're talking about. So, what I wanted to ask you is I just picked out a couple that I thought I'd ask you to talk about. So, the first one is acetic acid. So, explain why that's tested and why, and what the winemaker does with that information.
So acetic acid can be produced in multiple forms, but generally when grapes come in, it should be negligibly zero. You might see some lots that have some level of microbiological spoilage that comes in from the vineyard. And it might, when initially load into tank or press off white juice, you might get a number of some tenths or hundredths, but hopefully low. There's a legal limit for bottling, and most humans can detect kind of around 0.7. And then when you get above 1 gram per liter, that's when people start to consider kind of spoiled on most wines, or start the wine essentially heading to vinegar. So initially in the ferment, usually what's going to produce acetic acid, because it's all anaerobic, because of the level of CO2 being produced, is going to be spoilage yeast. Will be what's often producing the acetic acid, the volatile acidity. And as you progress through fermentation, the wine becomes, mostly alcoholic or totally alcoholic. All the sugar is converted to alcohol. When you get to that stage, usually what's the contributing factor is oxygen headspace in a barrel or a tank, and films that are form of acetobacter on the surface of the wine. So acetobacter, acetic acid bacteria, that's kind of the name root why that has come about. So those are going to be producing acetic acid and causing the wine to spoil and head towards vinegar in only aerobic oxygen containing environments. So that's why you top barrels, that's why you roll tanks, that's why you top tanks, backgas the headspace in tanks with some sort of pressurized system of nitrogen or argon or CO2. So you're just trying to eliminate the fact that if you don't have oxygen, you're not going to have acetobacter spoiling the wine. So those would be the different contribution sources. Yeah.
If I'm at home and I'm making wine at home, say, right, is that where it starts to smell like nail polish, is remover or something like that? Is that what that is, or is that something else?
Yeah. So like ethyl acetate, so either like paint thinner or like nail polish, depending what you're more filled with. So ethyl acetate, acetone, those type of smells. That's usually more the fermentative aroma. Whereas I would say the acetobacter smell is usually like later stages when it's wine. It smells kind of maybe closer to vinegar, or what people often describe as like a high tone aroma, like a high tone or a chemical, but it's not quite as, I would say, nail polish remover as it is in a fermenter.
And then the other one I think is fascinating for a lot of people is the whole sulfur sulfite conversation. I think you probably like the perfect person for us to talk about this. So one of the tests that you guys sell is a free sulfite test. So explain what that is and why that's important.
So winemakers historically use free sulfur to correlate to the level of antimicrobial stability they have in a wine. So they're looking at an equilibrium between molecular SO2, which is at very, very small part per million concentrations, but that's your active antimicrobial. So they're using pH, which you can measure with our system or with a pH probe. So they're using pH, free sulfur, and using that through some conversions to correlate to a level of molecular SO2 that is in that wine because we measured this amount of free sulfite, the actual like free sulfur that's in the wine. So it's a correlation measurement using the acidity, the pH of the wine, and that number that you're getting to infer how much stability you have. Now, molecular stability is kind of wine to wine dependent because tannins are antimicrobial as well. So tannins in red wine are much more prevalent than white because it's coming from the skins and the skin contact and the ferment. And generally, you don't want phenolics and tannins in your white wine. That's not usually something people consider favorable. So you don't have a lot of skin contact often on most white wines like red wines. So it's wine to wine dependent. And the lower pH, so pH closer or less than 3, like you see in sparkling wine and Rieslings, you're going to require a lot less free sulfur because of the level of acidity in that wine to get to the same level molecular. So to get to, let's say, 0.8 molecular or 1 molecular, which is often considered, I think, a very good stability standpoint from an antimicrobial in wine, on like a Riesling, it might take an add of like 10 ppm. And let's say there's a Cabernet that has a pH of 3.8. So instead of 3, it's 3.8, which doesn't seem like a big difference, but pH is a logarithmic base 10 scale. So each tenth is pretty significant. So at 3.8, it's going to take probably 50 plus to get anywhere near that and then some. So it's going to take a lot higher free sulfur dose to get to an antimicrobial standpoint with just sulfur. And that's why people talk about filtration with wines, because you're looking to remove some level of the microbial load that is in the wine. So it's all this balance between filtration, sterility of the wine, how much antimicrobial protection you have from sulfur in the wine. But anytime a wine's aging, we talk about sulfur quite often in most wines because that's what's protecting it as it ages from an oxygen standpoint as well as a microbial standpoint. So nothing's spoiling the wine.
I think sulfur usage, it's, at least in the wineries I've been working at and just in talking to people, it's a big topic for everybody, which is, why is it used? And, is too much being used? And is it something that's causing me to get a headache when I drink wine and that kind of stuff? So where do you stand on that? Is sulfur something that can cause people who have a sensitivity to it to get headaches and that kind of stuff? Is that what it is, or is it something else?
I think it's something else. It's probably often like histamines or some nitrogen developed compounds that we're pretty sensitive to in humans. Now, I have worked the harvest in Chile. The one lady was very allergic to sulfur. Like she broke out a severe rash when she mixed it up in a bucket, but that's not an ad. That's not the concentration you would see in a bottle of wine. That's like the concentration in a 5-gallon bucket that you're going to dump in a 40,000 gallon tank. So, most wines from a total sulfur standpoint, I'd say stop at probably about 120, and from a free standpoint are probably about 30 or 40 parts per million. That's parts per million. So I'd say to a lot of the people or the conversations I've had before with sulfur allergies, it's like, do you eat any dried fruit? Because you should probably look at the back of a lot of those packages, like raisins and craisins and all of those. There's a lot of sulfites to preserve a lot of different types of food. And in those foods, it's often much higher than what you ever see in wine.
So, all right. So let's talk about Montinore Estate. I guess the winery's in Forest Grove, Oregon. So this is established in 1982. They do some interesting wines, which is how kind of it got on my radar. They make not only Pinot, I guess Pinot Noirs, I guess they make the most of that. Is that right?
Well, that's the Willamette Valley. So we're just along for the ride with everyone else. That's
Okay. Okay.
I don't know
Yeah.
what the changing statistic is, but it's probably still safe to say that 70% of the grapes in Oregon are Pinot Noir.
Uh-huh. Okay.
I mean, it's always evolving. There's a lot of Chardonnay coming back, but majority of the valley, majority of the state is Pinot Noir. So
at Montinore, they have this 200-acre property, I guess, estate. Now, not all the grapes for all the wines are grown there, or do all the wines get made from those 200 acres?
not since I've been there. We've done some purchasing. A lot of the purchasing was done for our Red Cap Pinot Noir to expand that program, which is our entry level Pinot at $20. So the reserve Pinot that you have is 100% estate from that estate in 2018. So, and I would say I think, I'm trying to think back to 2017. I think in 2017, 2018, one of the years we had a little bit of BD fruit that we purchased from Cooper Mountain, which is actually quite close to my house in Beaverton. And I can't remember which year it went in, but I think on any given year, it's 3 blocks at Montinore Estate. It's 3 blocks of Pinot from that 200-acre estate specifically. So kind of even narrowing the acreage down to probably less than like 35 acres of Pinot from that specific estate. And the 3 blocks that were used or often are used for the reserve Pinot year to year, they kind of follow this laurelwood swell of soil through the site. So we have a lot of the blown in loose, different from like the state soil of Jury. So a lot of the soil in like the Dundee Hills is Jury and volcanic, so Jury and Acaia. There's also a lot of sedimentary soil that's like Yamhill Carlton, the Ribbon Ridge. So that other vineyard I mentioned in Yamhill Carlton, that's sedimentary soil, so it used to be the sea floor. So there's a couple of different soil classification groups and types, but at this estate, it's laurelwood is the dominant soil, and that's what this Pinot is particularly grown on, and why we think it makes it special.
We hear a lot in wine at wineries and in winemaking the term biodynamic, and I also saw on the website there is something that's called CCOF certified organic. So for people like me who don't 100% understand what that means, what does that actually mean?
So certification of any type essentially means you fill out a lot of paperwork. That's what I did. So we had a lot of paperwork, a lot of data tracking, and then you have inspections year to year. So it's not only following the practices, but it's being certified by an outside agency. So the U.S., in all of their wisdom, has decided to make organic certification both vague and very complicated. Vague in the fact that we have a national organic program that has a set list of things, and you have to use things that are on that list. But the list is quite vague, I would say, to be the best way to describe it. The one thing as a chemist that's kind of mind-boggling to me is argon is a noble gas, which means it can't interact with anything. We're not allowed to use argon in biodynamics. It's also kind of prohibitively expensive in winemaking, but you can't use something that's actually inert, but you can use nitrogen and carbon dioxide that actually interact with the wines. Obviously, carbon dioxide is also produced during the fermentation, so that's kind of not really a contamination point in winemaking because it's being produced by the yeast, but stuff like that. And then there's multiple different agencies. So we used to be certified by Stellar for organic until Stellar kind of went defunct. So we switched to CCOF, which is a California-based one. So if you buy a lot of fruits from California, you'll probably see CCOF as an organic certifier. There's also USDA, Oregon Tilth, with some of the other ones that we see around up here, but they're all organic certifiers that kind of are slightly taking their own twist on the National Organic Program, the NOP list. So that's how the U.S. has complicated that a little bit. Demeter is an international organization and is a little bit more uniform in that sense that there only is one biodynamic organization. And they're trying to reunify the international and the US groups, I think, right now. Demeter, the way I like to think about it, or the way it's easier to make everyone understand, is it's just a more strict organic following, where instead of looking at the inputs into the soil or the actual like vegetable that you might be talking about, it looks at it from a whole farm perspective. So you're looking at all of the things that are contributing to that site, as opposed to maybe just micro looking at the crop standpoint. That would be the best way to describe it. But it's a more strict organic farming that looks more holistically at the whole farm.
So, what are some of the requirements? I mean, what are some of the things that you have to do in order to be considered, certified organic?
So we're limited in the vineyard side from the sprays that we can use. So a lot of the sprays we use are more elemental. We use a lot of oils. We use a lot of like sulfur spray. And when I say sulfur, different from winemaking, here we're talking about like actual elemental sulfur, S8. So like pure sulfur from a periodic table standpoint. Whereas in the winery, people will say sulfur, but they mean sulfites, whether that be sulfur dioxide gas or like liquid 6% sulfurous acid or potassium metabisulfite. All of those dissolved in water are the same thing when they're added to wine. So it's a little different in that sense. But sulfur in the vineyard, oil sprays. But because we're organic, the sprays don't have as long as a longevity window of effectiveness to be antimicrobial versus the things that can grow on the buds when they start to emerge, which will become the eventual clusters and grapes. So the sprays occur all year from the moment that the actual plant is exposed outside of the cane, outside of the wooden part of the plant, and what will eventually become the grapes, because any sort of microbe that's in the environment could fall on them and then eventually end up inside or outside of the berry and thus into the ferment and into the wine. Oregon has a lot more disease pressure because we have moisture more so than California. So it's a little easier to be certified organic in California than it is in Oregon. And probably the worst scenario that you can have from like a spoilage standpoint or disease pressure in the vineyard is when you have a whole lot of moisture, whether that be humidity or rain or fog, and then you have a massive heat spike immediately after. So you got moisture and now you have heat. It's like any micro bloom dream right there for life. So we're limited by the sprays we can use in the vineyard, and I'm a lot less of an expert about that than I am about the wine side. And then coming into the winery, I would say almost all the additives we use, when you're not talking about the acids that we could add, like we can add tartaric acid or we can add sugar to capitalize or increase the acidity of the wine if we're not happy with what it comes in at, are almost all yeast based. So they're essentially inactivated, like yeast, the shells of the yeast hulls. Almost all the products that we use from a nutrition standpoint, as well as like an additive standpoint, add mouthfeel or texture. All of those are yeast-based products essentially. So we have a limited range of things. We can't use different additives that might help with like tartaric acid stability at bottling. We have to actually go through traditional cold stabilization to prevent the wine diamonds that everyone talks about in their glasses. So not really a flaw, but it's viewed as a flaw, I would say. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that in the glass, but the wine just wasn't cold stable at the conditions it was exposed to. So there's some products now that you don't actually have to chill the tank down, expose it to being really cold, more oxygen dissolved, that will actually encapsulate the crystals, but they're all synthesized things, so we can't use those in biodynamics or organics. So things like that we're limited by, and we have to stick to the more naturally derived additives.
So, when we talk about Montinore, what's the winemaking philosophy there? How would you explain that?
I would say that we're trying at all times to be, is the least amount of intervention that we have to be from like an additive standpoint. We want to work the ferments and the fruit and extract what we can from the actual grapes and the skins, whether that be like in the press with white wine or in the actual active ferment with different cap actions to, extract from the red skins, seeds, and pulp while we're fermenting them. So we want to do as much physical work to prevent the additive work, I would say. But at the end of the day, the goal is to make really high quality wine. So with the evolving vintages that Oregon has and the differentiated vintages Oregon has with the rolling, with warm levels of warm, cold, disease pressure at harvest, disease pressure at bloom, we were always focused on making high quality, really good wine. So we weren't going to handicap ourselves by saying we're going to be non-intervention. We don't add anything just for the principle of it. So at the end of the day, the goal was to make good wine.
So I noticed that they make a couple of interesting wines. So I was going to ask you about. There's two grape varietals that I have never tried or even heard of, and so there was, and I don't even know if I'm saying it right. So a Teroldiga, is that how
Teraldigo,
am I saying
Teraldigo,
Teroldiga? Yeah,
Teraldigo.
and then yeah. So what is that? I know that's a Spanish varietal, I guess, right, or Italian varietal, or something of that nature. So tell me about that. I've never heard of that before, but it's interesting.
So Teraldigo and the Grind are at the absolute limits of probably ripeness in the Willamette Valley. They're originally from the Alto Adige, and at Montinore, when we bring those varietals in, it signals the end of harvest. They come in maybe a week after the Riesling sometimes. So it's like we pick the Riesling, which is late anywhere. It's a late ripening varietal. Those come in later. The last couple years, because of the heat we've had into the summer, we've picked them kind of towards mid-October, but historically it's often been like end of October, early November is when we would pick those. And in 2019, when we had kind of a more traditional cooler Oregon vintage, especially at harvest, we actually picked them at close to sparkling chemistry and brought them in and did some level of creative deacidifying. We didn't have to use any bicarb to actually deacidify the wine, which just acts by converting the acid into gas, into carbon dioxide gas, and then it's gone from the fermenter, so you're removing the acid that way. We did a lot of whole cluster, which adds potassium to the wine, and that helps do some level of deacidification. And then we did an extremely long cold soak for those two varietals, essentially stick as much tartaric acid we could to the side of the jackets of the tank, so just drive it out of solution. And we got them in the end to a point where they were higher titratable acidity, higher acidity in those wines than maybe we wanted with the level of tannin, because they're both very tannic and colorful varietals. So a lot of color, a lot of tannin. If you wanted to make a rosé out of those, you certainly wouldn't be able to wait more than probably 10 seconds after filling the tank, because it's already pretty much dark colored juice. So the varietals are related to Pinot Noir as well as Syrah. So there's some Pinot Noir and Syrah parentage in them, but they're not really seen much outside of the Alto Adige. There's a couple other places that do Lagrein in the Willamette Valley, but Teraldigo is more rare, but it's kind of the darling child or the favorite grape in the Alto Adige in Italy. And I personally think it's the more interesting.
So what do they taste like?
I would say from my personal standpoint, it doesn't have a long amount of ageability. So it's super tannic, so you have to be careful about that because it tastes best when it's young. It's got a lot of fruit and berry, and then maybe a little bit of level of earthiness, whereas Teraldigo has, again, a lot of that berry flavor, but it's usually backed up by some level of like ageability where there's more earthy notes and herbal notes that kind of have some more longevity to them. Think like a very earthy like wine with some level of berry in it.
I saw those on there on the website, and I was thinking, wow, that's pretty cool because, like I said, I like things that are different and things that I've never had or interesting, and definitely will pick up those just so I could see what they're all about. So before we go, let's talk about this Reserve Pinot a little bit more. So this is one that I know you recommended, and so why this wine? Did you recommend this one? And talk a little bit about this wine specifically.
So pick this wine because we actually distribute this in 3-tier, like the Red Cap. It's not just available through our tasting room, like some of the single blocks. Most years, this is made up of a majority of the Grams block Pinot Noir, which is right outside the winery's back door. It's kind of what we consider the best block on the estate. And the only reason it has a particular name in those wines, the single blocks from that estate have names, is because there had to be some level of differentiation on the bottle. Because there are 3 different Montinore single vineyard wines that are from 3 specific blocks. So there's 3 different names. So those make up the Reserve Pinot, the Grams block, the Plumley Road, formerly called Cataclysm. I think that name switched in 2016 and 17 because marketing wise, they didn't feel like the wine was very cataclysmic. It was referring to like the Missoula floods and the cataclysmic floods, but the wine itself was more I say, Volnay style Pinot as opposed to like a massive Pommard Pinot, maybe, if that makes sense. So that's what that name change came about. And then Parsons Ridge. So different clones coming together. Graham's block is Vadensville and Pomard with a very small amount of 777 in the one corner. And then block 3 or Parsons Ridge is the Ponzi upright clone, so it's Pomard. And then there's 3 different clones, all Dijon clones planted in block 1, which is the Plumley Cataclysm. So all those kind of come together, those 3 individual single vineyards, single blocks. And this wine is the estate Pinot. So I just felt like it was a nice representation of Montinore on that vintage from the Pinot that we produced from the best blocks. And the single blocks, each of those is capped not necessarily by quality, but by case count needs in the tasting room. So there's a lot of good wine that ends up in here because the tasting room only needs so many cases of the single blocks. There's a lot of really good wine in this bottle that if we made more of the single blocks, wouldn't be in this bottle, I guess. So that's why I kind of picked this wine, I would say, because it's emblematic of the estate of the Pinot planted there.
Yeah, I was drinking this while we were talking, and it's a very nice wine. Like, how would you describe it to somebody as far as how it tastes and what they can expect out of this?
So what I like about the Pinot from this estate is there's always a very nice, like, earthy mushroom herbal note that goes on in an undertone perspective, but then there's still a lot of berry, and the berry often from Graham's block tends a little darker. It's much more very red fruit driven, raspberry, strawberry from like Parsons Ridge. Parsons Ridge has a lot of tannin that contributes. Some of the more herbal notes are coming from Graham's block. And then there's usually nice acidity coming through from block 1. So it's a balanced Pinot. 2018, I think, is some of the riper Pinots that we made. Part of that was, again, somewhat logistics. We were bottling and then went straight into harvest that year because it was an earlier vintage. It was a warmer vintage, but I think we picked things in 2018 maybe slightly riper than we would have liked. So we added a little bit more acid in the fermenter. So these wines are drinking well right now, I think, because they were picked a little bit riper. So there's a lot more fruit in our 2018s from Montinore than you'll see in the 2019s, which are some of my favorites. Partially because that nice balance between acidity and fruit. This sits on a little bit more of a riper spectrum for Oregon and for Montinore.
Yeah, this is an excellent Pinot, and I've had a lot of experience just recently with a lot of Willamette Valley, Oregon Pinot. So this is a very nice wine, and for the price, it's so reasonably priced. It seems to me. I think it was about $50 or $40, something like that, or do you know?
I think it's like 38, but I could be wrong.
Oh, it is. Oh, gosh. Okay, so even more reasonable than I was even thinking. So, all right. So Benjamin, I really appreciate your time. It's been awesome. I've learned so much, which is one of the reasons I do this podcast. My last question for you is the same question I ask everybody, which is, besides this Pinot, what else are you drinking right now?
What else am I drinking right now? Well, okay, so we're going to deviate a little bit from the wine podcast. So I think I spent the last week, as you know, skiing in Sun River, and the group of us in the house that were staying there, and obviously not the 13-month-old, but the group of us that were staying in the house together consumed a lot of beer. So some of my favorite breweries are also in Oregon. It's another great thing about living here is you're not just tied to the wine, the great wine that's around. So I've been drinking a lot of Crux and Deschutes beer, I would say. And since we're having pizza for dinner tonight, that's probably what we'll have. Although I do like pizza and Pinot, I would say. So we drink a lot of Pinot. So if I have to say what wine I would be drinking, I think I like a lot of stuff out of Brick House in the Ribbon Ridge. Smaller, I think they're about less than 5,000 cases. I'm also a big fan of what Joseph Duran's project, Domaine Druin. I like a lot of their wines, especially their Pinots that they produce out of the Dundee Hills. I like a lot of the Dundee Hill Pinots, all the red fruit driven, like very, very red fruit driven wines that you see there. So I'm a big fan of that area too. So I guess those would be the Pinots I would be drinking.
How about something outside of Oregon?
Outside of Oregon, there are some good wines down in California. They're not all like buttery Chardonnays and like massive over extracted Cabernets. So last trip down to California for Admeo, I did go to Stag's Leap Wine Cellars. So I've always have, and I do like their wine. So I brought home a Malbec from them actually, as well as a couple different Cabernets. So That'd be something I've drank out of California recently. I wish I could drink more wines out of Burgundy, but that's a little pricey and harder to
Yeah.
get your hands on. So I would drink more red Burgundies.
Yeah, sure. I think everybody would like to do that. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Benjamin. Like I said, it was awesome. I really appreciate you taking all this time. I know you're a busy guy, and I learned a ton. And obviously, there's 1,000 more questions I wanted to ask, but we didn't get to those. So maybe I'll check in with you again one of these days, and we could talk about some of those other things. So, thank you so much. Like I said, it was awesome. I really appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
I want to thank Benjamin Eyer for what I thought was a very informative interview tonight. I really feel like I learned a lot about how science can help winemakers make better wine. Benjamin's a good example of some of the really smart people who work at wineries these days to help make the best wine possible. As consumers, we're the ones who really benefit from their passion and expertise. Finally, I encourage you to visit the show website at www.obsessedwithwine.net. There you can listen to past episodes and read tasting notes from wines recommended by the guests who have appeared on the show. I also want you to sign up for the mailing list so you can take advantage of the bonus episodes I'm going to be releasing in the near future. Only those who are part of the mailing list will have access to those bonus episodes, so I don't want you to miss out on anything. I would also love for you to join the Obsessed with Wine podcast discussion group on Facebook. There you can interact with me and other fans of the show. You can also join the Obsessed with Wine community on Instagram and Twitter. There we discuss all things wine, share pictures of our wine adventures, and give updates on upcoming episodes. Thank you, and I will see you next week. Cheers!